A video went viral recently of a woman explaining that her parents paid nearly $1 million combined into Social Security over their working lives, and that her stepfather died at 61 before he ever collected a single dollar of it. Her mother then received survivor benefits for a few years before passing away herself. The comment section split the internet right down the middle. Some people called it proof the system robs you blind. Others called the framing completely misleading. I want to walk through exactly what happened in that family situation, because I think there's a real important lesson buried underneath all the arguing, and most of the people debating it online never actually got to it. I'm Linda Foster, and let me start with the actual numbers from that story, because they matter. The stepfather worked his whole life, and between him and his wife, they'd paid in just over $1 million combined. He passed away at 61, before reaching even the earliest age to claim retirement benefits, which is 62. Because he died before collecting anything, his widow became eligible for survivor benefits based on his earnings record instead of her own, since his record produced a higher monthly amount than hers would have. She began collecting that survivor benefit, and the math worked out to around $32,000 a year. She collected for several years before she herself passed away, at which point the payments simply stopped. To the daughter telling this story, that added up to her parents having paid in roughly $1 million and received back what felt like a small fraction of it, with nothing left over for the family afterward. Now, here's where I want to slow down, because the internet argument split into two camps almost immediately, and I think both camps were partly right and partly missing the point. One camp said this is exactly how Social Security is supposed to work, and that the daughter's framing was misleading. As several people pointed out directly in response to the original post, Social Security isn't a 401k or a personal retirement account. You don't have an individual pot of money sitting there with your name on it, growing and waiting for you to withdraw it. It's closer to an insurance system, where current workers' contributions fund current retirees' benefits, and the amount any individual receives is based on a formula tied to their lifetime earnings, not a literal return of the specific dollars they personally paid in. Under that lens, nobody actually lost the money in the sense of it being stolen or withheld improperly. The stepfather's contributions, just like everyone else's, helped fund the broader system, including his own wife's survivor benefit while she was alive. The other camp's frustration, though, wasn't entirely off base either, and I don't want to dismiss it. There's a legitimate emotional and financial reality here. A family paid into a system for decades, expecting it to provide meaningful security, and the actual benefit received, relative to what was contributed, can genuinely feel small, especially when an early death cuts short the years someone would have collected. That frustration is real, even if the specific framing of Social Security kept the money isn't technically accurate. Here's what I think actually matters more than picking a side in that argument. This family's situation reveals something that a lot of people genuinely don't understand about how survivor benefits work, and understanding it correctly could change real decisions for people in similar situations right now. The core thing to understand is this: survivor benefits replace the higher of the two benefits in a household, not both. If the husband's benefit at full retirement age would have been larger than the wife's own benefit, she receives up to 100% of his amount as a survivor benefit, not her own benefit plus his. This is exactly what happened in the viral story. The wife's survivor benefit was based on her husband's record, because it was higher than her own would have been. She did not receive both her own retirement benefit and his survivor benefit stacked together. It's the larger of the two, not the sum of them. This single piece of information is worth understanding clearly before anyone in your own family makes a claiming decision, because it directly affects how much total household income survives after one spouse passes away. Let me also address something specific about the timing in this story, because it touches on a genuinely important planning point for married couples. The husband died before age 62, meaning he never claimed any retirement benefit at all. If he had lived longer and claimed his own retirement benefit before passing, the age at which he claimed would have directly determined what his wife's eventual survivor benefit looked like. Claim early, at 62, and the survivor benefit reflects that reduced amount. Wait until full retirement age, or even later, accumulating delayed retirement credits up to age 70, and the survivor benefit reflects that larger amount instead, permanently, for as long as the surviving spouse lives. This is precisely why I tell couples, again and again, that the higher earners claiming decision is one of the most consequential financial choices a married couple makes, because it doesn't just affect their own monthly check. It sets the ceiling for what their spouse will eventually receive as a survivor for the rest of that spouse's life, however long that turns out to be. In the viral story, since the husband died before claiming anything at all, his wife's survivor benefit was actually calculated as though he'd reached full retirement age, which is generally how the system handles a worker's death before they've started collecting. This detail matters because it means his early death, while obviously tragic, didn't reduce her survivor benefit the way an early claiming decision by a living worker would have. If he had lived to 62 and claimed early specifically because he was worried about his health, that decision would have permanently reduced what she eventually received as his survivor. I also want to address the earnings limit, since this connects to something a lot of younger widows and widowers run into without expecting it. If you're collecting a survivor benefit before reaching your own full retirement age and you're still working, an earnings limit applies. For 2026, that limit is $24,480. For every $2 you earn above that amount, $1 is withheld from your survivor benefit. Once you reach your full retirement age, this limit disappears entirely, and your benefit is no longer reduced because of your income. Let me also address what happens, since it came up directly in the viral story, when the surviving spouse eventually passes away too. Survivor benefits, like retirement benefits generally, stop at the death of the recipient. They don't pass down to adult children. As several commenters correctly pointed out in response to the original post, Social Security does provide benefits to children, but generally only while they're under 18, or under 19 if still in high school, or if they became disabled before age 22. Adult children with no disability simply aren't eligible recipients of a parent's Social Security benefit, regardless of how much that parent paid into the system over their lifetime. This is exactly the piece of the viral story that generated the most disagreement, and it's also the piece that's most clearly accurate under the actual rules, even though it can feel genuinely hard to accept emotionally. I want to be careful here, because I don't think the right response to a story like this is simply telling people their feelings about it are wrong. The frustration of paying into a system for 40 years and having the benefits end relatively quickly after an early death is a completely understandable reaction. What I think is actually useful, rather than just validating or dismissing that frustration, is making sure everyone watching this understands exactly how the system works, so they can make informed decisions for their own family, rather than being surprised later the way this family clearly was. So here's what I'd actually want every married couple, and especially every couple where one spouse's health is a serious concern, to do differently. First, understand clearly that your survivor benefit will be based on whichever of your two benefits is higher, not the sum of both. If there's a meaningful gap between your benefit and your spouse's, the higher earner's claiming age matters enormously for what the lower earner, or whichever spouse outlives the other, will eventually receive. Second, if a spouse has serious health concerns and there's genuine uncertainty about how long they might live, that's worth factoring honestly into the claiming conversation, alongside everything else. Claiming early protects against the worst-case scenario of receiving nothing at all if death comes before any benefit is ever collected. But it also permanently locks in a lower amount for any survivor benefit calculated from that record. There's no single right answer here. It's a genuinely personal decision that depends on health, other assets, and what matters most to your specific family. But it's a decision that should be made with full information about the trade-off, not discovered after the fact. Third, and this is the piece that gets the least attention in stories like this one, talk to your own family, your spouse, your adult children about how this system actually works, before a death forces everyone to learn it under the worst possible circumstances. The daughter in the viral story was clearly blindsided by aspects of how this worked, and that confusion, layered on top of grief, made an already difficult situation feel even more frustrating than it needed to. Let me close with the honest summary. Nobody in that family's story did anything wrong, and the system didn't malfunction or improperly withhold anything. What happened is exactly how survivor benefits are designed to work, replacing the larger benefit rather than stacking both, ending at the survivor's own death rather than passing to adult children, and reflecting whatever claiming decisions were made along the way. Whether that design feels fair to you is a legitimate, separate conversation worth having. But understanding it accurately, rather than through a viral video stripped of context, is what actually lets you make better decisions for your own family. If this was useful, share it with someone you love who's married and hasn't yet had a direct, honest conversation about how survivor benefits would actually play out in their own household. Let me go a bit deeper into a couple of pieces here because I think the specifics genuinely help, especially for anyone watching this who recognizes part of their own situation in this story. I want to address something about the actual application process, since this connects directly to one detail in the viral story that's worth understanding clearly. Unlike retirement benefits, you cannot apply for survivor benefits online. This surprises a lot of people since so much of Social Security has moved towards self-service digital tools. Survivor benefit claims have to be made by phone or in person by calling 1-800-772-1213 or visiting a local Social Security office. If you're recently widowed or you're helping a parent or relative through this process, knowing this in advance prevents the frustration of searching online for an application that simply doesn't exist in that format. I also want to address the documentation typically required, since being prepared with this in advance makes an already difficult conversation considerably easier. You'll generally need the deceased worker's Social Security number, your own Social Security number, a marriage certificate if you're applying as a spouse, the deceased's death certificate, and recent tax information or W-2 forms for both yourself and the deceased. Having these gathered before you call, rather than scrambling for them mid-conversation while you're also grieving, genuinely smooths out what can otherwise feel like an overwhelming process. Let me also address something specific about the timing of when to actually call, since this matters more than people realize. There's no requirement to wait any specific period after a death before contacting Social Security. And in fact, contacting them sooner rather than later is almost always the better approach, since survivor benefits generally aren't paid retroactively beyond a limited window in most circumstances. If you've recently lost a spouse and haven't yet made this call because the timing has felt too soon or too overwhelming, this is exactly the kind of situation where reaching out, even just to ask questions and understand your options without committing to anything immediately, is worth doing sooner rather than later. I want to revisit the claiming age conversation one more time because I think it deserves a concrete example with real numbers, since abstract explanations tend to be less convincing than seeing the actual dollars involved. Take a husband with a full retirement age benefit of $2,400 a month. If he claims at 62, his own benefit is reduced to roughly $1,760 a month, a 30% permanent reduction. If he waits until 70, accumulating delayed retirement credits, his benefit grows to roughly $2,976 a month instead, a 24% increase above the full retirement age amount. If he passes away after either of these claiming decisions, his wife's eventual survivor benefit reflects whichever amount he was actually receiving, or in some cases, the full retirement age amount if he passed before reaching it himself. The difference between her eventually receiving roughly $1,760 a month versus $2,976 a month for potentially 15 or 20 years as a widow is not a small detail. It's a difference that can total well over $200,000 across a typical widowhood, depending on how long she lives. This is exactly the kind of calculation that should happen at a kitchen table, with both spouses' actual numbers in front of them, well before either person claims anything, rather than being discovered, confused, and after the fact, the way it clearly was in the viral story that prompted today's conversation. Let me close with one final thought I think matters beyond the specific mechanics I've covered today. Stories like the one that went viral spread quickly precisely because they tap into a real, widely shared anxiety about whether a lifetime of contributions to Social Security genuinely pays off the way people expect. That anxiety deserves a real, honest answer, not just a correction of technical inaccuracies in a viral post, and not just validation of frustration without any actual information attached. The honest answer is this: Social Security wasn't designed to function like a personal savings account that returns exactly what you put in, plus growth, to you or your heirs. It was designed as social insurance, providing income protection for retirement, disability, and survivorship, funded collectively rather than individually. Whether that design serves any particular family well depends enormously on specific circumstances, how long each person lives, what claiming decisions were made, and how the household's two benefit amounts compared to each other. Understanding those mechanics clearly, rather than through outrage stripped of context, is what actually empowers you to make better decisions for your own family, regardless of how the broader policy debate about the system's fairness ultimately plays out. If this was useful, share it with someone you love who's married, recently widowed, or simply curious about how this story everyone's been arguing about actually breaks down once you look past the headlines. I'll see you in the next one.